Hi, today we are very happy to have Mr. Peter Walk to join us to have a conversation and dialogue about lots of issues. And so now let me give Peter the chance to introduce himself about his work experience and his background.
Let me just start with my interest in China, which has been pretty high for probably 40 years. So I studied biographies of a lot of my favorite people, so composers, authors, etc. So I got to develop a better understanding of the East versus the West. I think Western philosophies and religions are what I would call dualistic by nature. So they're inherently judgmental. So you have good, bad, heaven, hell, etc.
Is that mostly influenced by this Christianity?
Yes, very influenced by Jewish and Christian faith. And I just didn't find that very appealing. I don't like the idea that people are constantly looking for winners and losers. So when I started the Eastern religions, and I started with Buddhism and Hinduism, I like very much the idea of harmony and balance. So I just said, I'm just basically an Easterner in a Western body. When I hit 60, I told my assistant I wanted to go to China every 6 to 8 weeks for a week.
So when was that? Which year?
That started probably 15 years ago. But I made over 80 trips to China because my field at McKinsey was insurance. So I was advising large insurance companies around the world.
So around the early 2000. So that was your first trip to China?
Yeah, first trips. And, well, I did some earlier trips when China was all bicycles, no cars.
Oh, in the 80s?
Yes, in the 80s and early 90s. But this was the first time I really spent dedicated time in China. And I wound up writing a book because I got so tired of reading in the Western press about the oppressive, corrupt government and the unhappy, oppressed people. And I said to myself, I've made over 80 trips. How come I've never met any of these unhappy, oppressed people?
But you travel to both the cities and the rural areas?
Yeah, but I'd say probably 75% would have been big cities.
Big cities,
most of the other time I was here for pleasure with my family, with my kids, and yeah. So, but I developed a pretty good feel for China overall. So I wrote a book that largely examines the real differences between the U.S. and China, because the U.S. is always saying our model is the only right model, that ultimately everyone is going to become a democracy. By the way, I don't believe that at all. So the US is an individualistic model, going back to escaping Europe. China is very much a collective model. US has a relatively, they don't like to hear these words, a relatively weak government by design. So when the founding fathers developed the Constitution in the US, they basically said, let's do everything we can to minimize what the government is allowed to do, because this should be a country of, by, and for the people. And China, on the other hand, had a very strong central government, has going back thousands of years. It's always had that. In part, I think, because people need to come together to protect against the invasions from the north. And then also the number of catastrophes, weather catastrophes, that required people to come together to kind of rebuild. So the model was very much...
So the U.S. seems to have a natural national border, so it's much safer.
Yes,
to
totally.
China surrounding.
Yeah, we had no equivalence. I mean, when settlers arrived in in the U.S., the country was basically owned by Indians, who were relatively unsophisticated, and the U.S. in a not very nice way, basically.
But it seems the U.S. president, in the time of emergency, for example, perhaps also has a lot of power.
Yes.
And the Congress can also, set up new laws to overrule, the old ones, in a time of emergency, maybe. So that makes the U.S. quite flexible. Dealing with crisis, and also during peaceful time, maybe government try to minimize the size. But
there is one very significant difference is the best and the brightest young people in the U.S. almost always go into business.
Go to business.
They do not go into government. They view as the government.
Law and the medical field.
Yeah.
Because that's where you make most of make a lot of money.
Make a lot of money.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the best and the brightest, going back to the Mandarin tradition in China, generally went into public service and government.
Right, yes.
But the net effect is, you know, if I think about the people I've met in the Chinese government, they are highly educated. They tend to be pretty worldly and have had jobs in different sectors.
But how would you compare this kind of U.S. system with European countries? Because, you know, the whole process we call, you know, so-called modern civilization, whether that be scientific revolution or industrial revolution, they actually started in Europe. But how the European countries' political system differ from the U.S. or they're similar?
They're similar in the sense that they're both democracies. So you rely on votes to select your leaders.
But their democracy come much later, right? Starting in the 18th century, 19th century, none of the European countries was a democrat. Had a democracy. Right? It was under monarchy mostly.
Yeah, and you also had, Europe was a very deeply ingrained class system. Whereas the U.S. from the very beginning was not a class system. I mean, the purpose was equal opportunity for everyone because they were escaping Europe, which was a class system. But I think the economies evolved in fairly similar ways. I think the difference in the U.S. is the U.S. relied very much on immigration for creativity. So a lot of the great inventions, discoveries, they came out of America really can be traced back to Europeans who emigrated to the United States frequently because they wanted to escape oppression.
Seems from the Chinese point of view, you know, when I talk to a lot of Chinese, whether they're from different background, when they talk about the U.S., it seems they have a much bigger picture in their mind. Is they talk about the West, and they know that the rise of the West started in Europe. So therefore, they like to compare what's the major difference between Europe and China. Then starting from there, they try to they move to what's the major difference between U.S. and China. So therefore, I would like to know from your point of view, you know, if you compare Europe with China and compare Europe with the U.S., what kind of, you know, major difference in terms of whether that be political system or institutions or some other background you see? The contrast between U.S. and China seems much striking larger. But if you compare Europe and China, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century when Europe rose up, maybe the difference was different, or different type of difference. How would you see that?
Well, I mean, obviously, there wasn't that much interaction between the Europeans and China until the Opium Wars in the 19th century. And I think, especially Great Britain, which kind of took the lead, I think that created a pretty high level of tension between China and the Europeans. I think the Americans played a role in the Opium Wars, but it wasn't a dramatic role. And I think I'd say the Europeans in general were more aggressive.
Also, they seems their government had more centralized power. To facilitate industrialization, Like, and that's why First World War, Second World War took place among those European countries.
Well, I think, I mean, to me, the main thing that happened in the 19th century is that China missed the Industrial Revolution.
That's a very interesting point.
So you had the Qing dynasty run by the Manchus, where frankly you have examples like Empress Xixi, who spent the treasury on rebuilding the Summer Palace as opposed to the Navy, which is what it was meant for. So I think the inward focus of the Manchus under the Qing dynasty led to a lack of interest in what was going on in the rest of the world and not any real intellectual curiosity. So when you had the Brits show up for the first time with here are all of our discoveries and here's what's enabling us to modernize, the response from the Empress or Emperor at the time was very much, we have nothing to learn from the West.
I think that time China really was not aware or know very little about what's going on in Europe.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you think they might have behaved differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you think about Chinese history, if you missed the Industrial Revolution, which was really affecting most of the advanced Western countries, and the US and the UK probably played the prominent role.
Maybe that's also why historians often talk about, Germany used to be a backward area or nation, was not even unified. And until maybe late second half of 19th century, then Germany started to emerge as a power.
Yes.
So how could Germany do that, whereas other European nations like Poland, I don't know, failed to achieve that?
Yeah.
And also in Asia, Japan, came into place, and but people also talk about how come Japan succeeded in capturing the process of industrialization, whereas China keep falling behind.
If you take those two examples, I mean, what was the common denominator is both Germany and Japan were very anxious to build up their industrial might for military reasons. Mm-hmm. So Japan was very aggressive militarily vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and other areas. So I think once you start down that track, then you want to be able to build ships, you want to be able to build an army, you want to be able to build everything that goes with military might. And Germany, exactly the same. Actually, Germany was obviously a very major player in European wars in the late 19th century, and then very aggressive and active in World War I and World War II. So I think a lot, in those two cases, the industrialization followed a military spin.
War created capitalism. So capitalism arose in Europe, not in Asia, because they had a constant state of wars. Mm-hmm. And those war created demand for different type of organization, different type of financing, and obviously created a need to encourage commerce, because that gives you the money to finance wars. And therefore, so-called militaristic state way of industrialization actually came much earlier, like starting from Renaissance. Those Italian city-state, like Venice, they were essentially militaristic state. On one hand, they need commerce. On the other hand, they need a strong army, military. So later on, as a later comer, like Germany and Japan, they need to do more. Otherwise, they would not be able to squeeze in to become a power. Yeah. So all the European powers, like in France, Louis XIV and Napoleon, and so all the European powers had this feature of militaristic industrialization. So maybe that's another explanation for China's failure. They never thought of or wanted to go that road. I think Qing Dynasty perhaps has another reason, because they are, like you mentioned, the minority to control the major Han people. Even like a city-state like Venice, if they want to rise up, they need essentially everyone to be able to fight and everyone to be able to do business. Yeah. But if the Chinese government do that, that means all the financial resources and the military power will shift to the Han people. That will create a threat. So maybe that's an additional reason they didn't take that route. Yeah. Whereas for Japan, once they have the emperor, who is the god of everyone, that seems that problem at least can be solved. I don't know. So that's one perspective. Yeah. Of course, the U.S. then become very different now, because the U.S. did not rely on monarch. They did not have any more kings, queens. But the U.S. later on also, like today, you look at the U.S. this military complex, industrial complex, is something analogous to that kind of tradition. Yes. Very strong in that. Yeah. So developing countries think that this seems to be one of the essential elements for any country to become industrialized. You need that to create the huge incentive and demand for heavy industries, for lots of other things, and for technology adoption, and otherwise you will be defeated, be killed. So that's one view. And of course, the U.S. has a lot of different features, like they minimize the size of government, but that's impossible for European. If you do that, perhaps you will be the next one to be destroyed. Yeah. How do you think this kind of perspective? This is essentially the view of Brodel and Songbot. You know, they think war created capitalism. So people say why capitalism never arises in East, in Asia. This provides one explanation. Of course, according to Max Weber, that he has a different view. His religion is different. Christian people, they are more industrious. They like to save. But that view seems not very consistent with history, because the Jewish people also, you know, very industrious, very like to save. Chinese or the Buddhist people, perhaps they may be also good at doing, I don't know, those kind of things. But they were not able to rise, maybe because of the lack of centralized militaristic industrialization motive, what you call like a national will, to use that will to mobilize resources, to organize the nation in a different way to compete with the European nations. But the US was able to do that, maybe not in the very beginning, but the US know that, right? They know the European, how they behave. So the US later on also built a military, also through the Civil War, that further enhanced the US military capacity. So that could play a role. So China, when China became sort of kind of have a mindset where we do need a national army to be militarized, was during the Civil War and the war against Japan. So that helped the Chinese finally to be organized militarily to fight. And with that military fighting capacity, then you enter the social planning era. But the social planning era, although you have a strong military kind of mindset, but you did not allow market to flourish. So you miss one part. And Deng Xiaoping solved that. He not only inherited this kind of military institutional capacity, but also allowed market. Whereas the Qing dynasty had maybe just market, but no this kind of lack of this.
I think there's two fundamental differences between the US and Europe. Europeans have always been a very highly fragmented continent. So you've got language differences, you have cultural differences, you have religious differences, and you also have the fact that war in the 19th century was almost a constant state. I mean, right up through World War I and then kicking in World War II. So I think that fragmentation, and even though they tried to solve it to some extent by creating the EU, there are still fairly significant differences among the major countries. It was a huge advantage for the US and China to basically have a large single language integrated country. And the US had the added advantage of, while it was involved in wars, it was never on their own land. So one of the reasons, I think, for the economic success of the US is they were able to avoid war other than selectively joining, as they did, obviously, in World War I and World War II. And then China, the same thing. I mean, China, the challenge for many years was the internal fighting of the warlords and the Civil War. But once under Deng, China became very focused on market-driven economy and consumerism. Deng just did an extraordinary job in a short period of time.
So this is interesting. So, you know, East European countries also conducted market reform, and their economic foundation was much more superior. You know, they had a social planning era, but they built lots of industries, including military industries. How come after introducing market reform, they could not perform as well as China? So you mentioned about Deng Xiaoping. So what's the major difference between Deng Xiaoping's leadership versus, you know, the leadership in East European countries? Where did they go wrong, in a sense? You know, they had a much better foundation to the market reform. They did not go through cultural revolution. So what's your, you know, view on this?
I think a huge advantage China has always had is just scale. So when you've got a consumer population today of 1.4 billion, even when you look at the Asian tigers, so when you looked at Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan and Korea, they have not been able to create anywhere near the economic footprint that China has created, in part because of the scale of the country, the population in China.
Yes, okay, so economy of scale is very important. That may also explain the US success compared to European countries. US had much larger scale, right? So even though German engineers, they may be very good, the Japanese may be very good, but your scale of the economy is very limited.
Yes.
Right? So on the other hand, there's also maybe some advantage for smaller countries. For example, you need to develop an economy, you need a mass production, and you need a global market. But the size of Singapore, because perhaps they only need a tiny bit of a global market that can support their industrialization.
Yes.
Whereas China needs the entire Earth, and the Earth is very limited. So that may also make smaller countries somehow easier on their way of industrialization in terms of creating global market.
Yeah.
I heard that during Singapore's industrialization process in the 60s, 50s, 70s, they had a huge sector of manufacturing wax. But that market alone is able to support lots of people's employment. For China, you cannot just rely on that.
Yeah.
You need to rely on perhaps other much larger markets such as textile. But the textile market globally is very limited. The US give China some quota, and so that's it. I heard from Taiwanese economists, they say US give them a quota, and soon the quota was filled. Then they have to search for alternative market. They say fortunately China opened their door for reform, so China became Taiwan's largest possible global market to absorb their industrial output. So then you look from that point of view, it's harder for China. Where's the global market? Now the US is also trying to shrink China's global market. So that will make China's industrialization process harder to finish?
Well, harder. First of all, I think the idea of containing China is a ridiculous idea. Because if you look at the economic momentum of China, if you look at the cultural advantages, Chinese people just work harder than Americans. And there's no denying that.
That's also the same view from the Europeans. They say Americans work much harder than the Europeans.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, look at European. I mean, the number of strikes and the number of holidays. I mean, when we McKinsey hire people from in North America, from France and from Spain, I mean, they just are used to a model that is far less demanding. Whereas China is again, dramatically harder workers. So having worked at McKinsey and worked in many of our U.S. offices, and then the same in China, it's very different.
How different?
Well, first of all, if you were to go to most Americans and say, you're going to work 6 days a week, not 5, you're going to work from 9 to 9, they'd say you're crazy. I mean,
but that's just
it would not be accepted
socially.
That's
the reason in the U.S., right? But you go back to 19th century, perhaps the average Americans work as hard as Chinese. They work for 6 days, even 7 days per day, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe during times of challenge, like war times. But I think, if I think about my father who grew up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, his hours were not dissimilar from people working in the U.S. today.
Okay.
When I would work with the Beijing or Shanghai office at McKinsey, you would just, if you watch, you would see the lights on very late at night, and then you'd see people falling asleep at their desks during the day because they basically got no sleep.
Maybe there's a pattern. Later comer, you have to work harder than the earlier ones.
Yeah.
So U.S. people, American people work harder than Europeans. And Chinese people have to work harder than the U.S. in order to come up. Otherwise, it's impossible. So just like the Germany and the Japan, they need to be far more militaristic state. Otherwise, there's no chance for them to rise up, because the stage was already fully occupied. Like in academia, in the U.S., it's so normal for all the professors stay in their office until 8, 9, sometimes even midnight. But I travel to Europe. It's impossible. If you do that, other people will look down at you. Why do you need to work so hard?
Sure.
So around 5 or 4, everybody just knock on other people's door saying, let's go home.
Yeah.
Precisely, U.S. is a latecomer in terms of industrialization. Maybe that explains why the U.S. behave differently. Yeah. Otherwise, but China compared to the U.S. is much even later comer. That's maybe one way to explain. But in the future, once China become rich, you will see Indian people work much harder, and the Chinese start to relax, and they want to get off around 4, and they only want to work for 3 or 5 days a week.
Yeah. I would say the Chinese work much smarter than the Indians do. So I'll give you an example. I was visiting Delhi. My family and I were going to go to Rajasthan in the north. We were on this beautiful 6-lane highway coming out of Delhi.
6-lane highway.
That's
very good.
Well, 3 each way.
Okay.
But it turned into a dirt road after about 50 miles.
Oh, okay. All right.
I said, well, what happened? Oh, the new mayor doesn't support Rajasthan and doesn't respect what they do. So he just stopped the road.
Okay.
So the amount of what I would call economic irrationality in India is huge.
This is huge.
So even though the people are very smart and they turn out more high-end students, which we saw at McKinsey than almost any other country, you do not have anything like the system in China where you've got large numbers of highly educated people advanced meritocratically in the party, and they're all on the same page. I mean, getting all Indians, I mean, just start with the Muslims and the Hindus, they are not a united country.
Right.
I think the U.S. for 150 years has been the top economy in the world. I think one reason you see very little intellectual curiosity in the U.S. about what other countries are doing is because they've been so used to the idea that we're number one. One reason they push back against China's success is because it's a dualistic mindset with winners and losers. So Americans genuinely believe that if China is very successful, they win and we lose. And you'd explain that to Chinese people and they say, why do you look at it that? Why don't you just say, don't we want both sides to win? If you just think about in our government and listening to government people talk about China, they know nothing about China.
Really? They know nothing?
And I talked.
Seems the Biden administration and even the Trump administration, they have lots of people seems they know China very well, so well so that they can design good policy to contain China.
Let's just say they're very confident, I would say grossly overconfident in what they know about China. I think if you ask them, tell me about Confucianism, they say, oh, we know all about that. The Confucian Institutes were put in the U.S. to spy. When you say, no, I'm talking about the Confucian values, you wouldn't find more than 5% of Americans who could explain anything about Confucianism. I was at Peking University and they said, Pete, we had a delegation of 16 Congress people, all very focused on China in a negative way. Of the 16, 1 had been to China 3 times, 1 had been to China once, 14 had never been to China.
Who are they?
I don't know.
Okay. Just about
but still, it's a very small number.
Right.
And when you listen to congressmen who generally are very aggressive about China and always explaining China and the way it works, so they'll frequently say, well, it's inevitable that China will become a democracy because the Chinese people are so unhappy. And you say, well, what evidence do you actually? They don't have any evidence because they've never been. And how do you explain
but maybe, on the other hand, maybe natural because I believe those congressmen, most of them have gone to Europe or even to Japan. But China just recently become developed. So therefore, they have not had the chance. Who want to go to a backward, underdeveloped country, right? The incentive was not there. You go to more developed or equal. When China just recently suddenly emerged, maybe they did not have the chance yet.
I mean, I just see it as a level of overconfidence based on 150 years of being number one. 150
years, okay, yes.
And I mean, it goes back to literally the late 1800s when the Industrial Revolution really gained steam. And the U.S. talks about the theft of intellectual property, like this is a unique thing. During the 19th century, the U.S. had a huge department in Washington whose only job was to steal intellectual property from the Brits.
Yes.
So this has been going on for years.
And actually the same, Brits, during their time, rise up, they spend a lot of energy stealing technology from Italy. And Italy stole technology from Arabs.
Yeah.
So this
has been going on forever.
Forever, that's right.
Yeah.
But later on, U.S. become an innovator. So and since then they start to think, we have always been an innovator and we're number one. That's true.
But I mean, China is innovative, but in a different way. China is much more application driven. So when the iPhone comes out, things like the iPhone and the internet and what I would call the big economic ideas, they tend to come from America. But if you look at the actual development of applications. So if you take the iPhone and look at all the businesses in China that have been built around the iPhone, it's pretty impressive and huge.
But it seems the same actually for the US, as you mentioned. In the 19th century, US was a student of Europe.
Yes.
And all the technology they learned, they copied, even they stole. But through that process, later on, you become on the top.
Yeah.
Maybe China was still in the stage of like early US.
Yeah.
Mostly rely on learning and mimicking.
Yep.
But later on, China will become an innovator on the top because you already start to see signs anywhere, right? Maybe that's a natural process for India. Someday maybe the same. India maybe nowadays or perhaps the next decades is still a very good student of learning, copying. But eventually they may become on the top, become a innovator in the frontier. I remember that in the 19th century U.S., if you search for encyclopedia, you search for a famous American scientist doing pure science, you find none, zero. But the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, U.S. was already become a top in terms of industrialization, in terms of commerce, in terms of application. But zero in pure scientific research. But once entered the 20th century, then U.S. become on the top. And in the early stage, U.S. will actually rely on immigrants from Europe because they have the two wars. But later on, U.S. start to have its own very famous and very innovative scientists, more and Americans. Then later on, you no longer see European names. Maybe that's just a natural process. So nowadays you still see China as very good at learning, mimicking, but you never know. I don't know. Maybe 20 years down the road, China may also start to have very innovative, not just the technology, but also in terms of basic research. The government is now pumping money into universities, and universities are reforming their way of educating people. So this is maybe a natural pattern. But it may not always be successful because many countries eventually could not move to the frontier.
But in many ways, China's already there. I mean, if you look at Huawei was the global leader in technology and telecom with 5G. And that was pretty impressive. And if you look at what China has done in EVs, and what they did in high-speed rail. So there are a lot of areas where China has, I think, leapfrogged the rest of the world.
Do you think that the U.S. policy now is pushing or encouraging Chinese to become an innovator in chip industry? Otherwise, why would they have the incentive? It's much cheaper to buy U.S. chips. High quality, low price. You do on your own, it's very costly. And now you say, you do on your own, we won't sell to you. Well, that may actually push China to there.
The reason you do want to become reasonably independent is you can't count on globalization. I personally think that the Contain China movement, history will look back on that as a very foolish idea. Because what you're doing is you're really encouraging China to double down on its investment in the areas where U.S. has a strength. And if you push the ultimate globalization or economic development, you're going to find that the Chinese, once they get truly independent of the U.S., they have long memories. They're not going to go back to the U.S. and say, well, okay, now let's be friends. They're going to say, you weren't there for us, and now we've matched you. We're going to go our own way, which would be a lose-lose.